The scene opens in a bank where a lot of customers are going about their business. Suddenly, the camera zooms in on a tense and dramatic moment. Jordan Matthews, a tall black man, is being forcefully led out of the bank by Officer Brian Davis. Jordan's hands are cuffed behind his back, and his calm demeanor contrasts with the rough treatment he's receiving. People in the bank stop what they're doing to watch the scene unfold, their faces reflecting a mixture of confusion and shock. What is happening? Why is Jordan being arrested? These questions linger in the air as the suspense builds. Officer Davis, who is visibly tense, leads Jordan to his patrol car with little care for the man's dignity. Every step Jordan takes seems heavy, not from fear, but from the weight of the injustice happening to him. The camera captures every detail: Jordan's unflinching calm and the determined look in his eyes. He isn't resisting, nor is he lashing out. Despite the rough handling, he remains composed, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with resolve. This leaves the audience wondering, who is this man, and why is he so calm under such humiliating circumstances? As Officer Davis pushes Jordan toward the police car, the officer mutters something under his breath, words laced with prejudice and anger. He makes remarks about Jordan not belonging in a place like this, his tone filled with disdain. These racially charged comments reveal Officer Davis's bias, and it's clear that Jordan's arrest is more than just a legal issue, it's personal. The tension between the two men is palpable, with Jordan's silence acting as a powerful statement against the injustice he's facing. Outside the bank, a crowd has started to gather. Passers-by, drawn by the commotion, begin filming the incident on their phones. One particular bystander, standing close enough to catch every word, records the entire exchange. Jordan is placed in the back of the patrol car, his expression still calm, but now, there's a sense of determination in his gaze. He knows this moment will have consequences, and it's clear he's already thinking ahead. The audience can feel that something bigger is about to happen. This moment is just the beginning of a much larger story. As the police car pulls away, the video captured by the bystander is already making its way online. Within minutes, social media platforms are buzzing with outrage and confusion. People are asking the same questions. Why was Jordan Matthews, a man with no criminal record, arrested in broad daylight at an upscale bank? The mystery around the situation only adds to the suspense, drawing the audience deeper into the story. The scene shifts back to earlier that day. Jordan Matthews, dressed in casual but stylish clothes, walks into the bank. He carries himself with the confidence of a man who has built his own empire, though his appearance doesn't scream billionaire. He greets the bank teller politely, asking to make a large withdrawal. The amount he requests causes the teller to pause, her eyes widening slightly as she asks for verification. Jordan calmly provides his identification, but the delay in processing the transaction draws unwanted attention. Officer Davis, stationed at the bank for security purposes, watches the interaction from a distance. His eyes narrow as he studies Jordan, quickly forming an assumption based solely on the man's appearance. He sees Jordan's request for a large sum of money and immediately suspects something is off. In Davis's mind, people who look like Jordan shouldn't be withdrawing that kind of money. His prejudice clouds his judgment, and without any real evidence, he decides Jordan is up to no good. As the teller continues to process the transaction, Davis approaches the counter, his hand resting on his belt in an intimidating manner. He interrupts the exchange, questioning Jordan's reasons for withdrawing such a large amount of cash. Jordan, maintaining his calm demeanor, explains that it's his money and he's simply making a withdrawal. Davis, however, isn't convinced. His suspicion grows, and he starts asking more aggressive questions, ignoring the bank teller's attempts to vouch for Jordan. Jordan remains composed, but there's a subtle shift in his posture. He's no longer just a customer at the bank. He's a man who knows his rights and is prepared to defend them. The tension between Jordan and Officer Davis rises as the officer, now convinced that Jordan is attempting some kind of fraud, decides to arrest him without any real cause. The bank employees and customers watch in stunned silence as Davis pulls out his handcuffs, restraining Jordan in front of everyone. The moment is humiliating, but Jordan doesn't fight back. Instead, he looks Davis in the eye, his calm gaze suggesting that this is far from over. The audience can feel the injustice of the situation. Jordan, who has done nothing wrong, is being treated like a criminal simply because of Davis's preconceived notions. The power dynamic between the two men is clear. Davis, armed with authority and prejudice, is in control for now. But Jordan's calm and unyielding presence hints that this moment will shift the balance of power later in the story. As Jordan is led out of the bank in handcuffs, the tension reaches a boiling point. The scene is uncomfortable to watch, not just because of the blatant racial bias at play, but because of the calm before the storm. The audience knows that something big is coming, but they're left waiting, their anticipation growing with every passing second. Once Jordan is taken to the police station, the truth about his identity begins to unfold. Officer Davis, still confident in his actions, runs Jordan's information through the system. As the results come back, Davis's expression shifts from smug satisfaction to shock. Jordan Matthews isn't just any man. He's a billionaire, a philanthropist, and a key figure in numerous business and charitable ventures. The officer's face drains of color as he realizes the gravity of his mistake. Meanwhile, word of the arrest has spread like wildfire. News outlets are picking up the story, and social media is exploding with outrage. The video of the arrest, uploaded by the bystander, has gone viral, sparking debates about racial profiling and the abuse of power. People are demanding answers, and Officer Davis finds himself at the center of a growing storm. Back at the police station, Davis is confronted by his superiors, who are furious over his actions. Jordan, sitting calmly in a holding cell, knows that he holds all the cards now. He could press charges, ruin Davis's career, and walk away victorious. But Jordan has a different plan in mind. Instead of seeking revenge, Jordan takes a more strategic approach. He reaches out to the media, offering to hold a public discussion about the incident, racial bias, and the broader issues plaguing law enforcement. His decision shocks everyone, including Davis, who expected the worst. Jordan's choice to rise above the situation, to use his influence for good, shifts the narrative entirely. In the days that follow, the conversation sparked by Jordan's arrest grows into a national movement. People are discussing not only the injustice he faced, but also the systemic changes needed to prevent such incidents in the future. Officer Davis, once a symbol of authority, is now the face of everything wrong with the system. His career is hanging by a thread, but in a surprising turn of events, Jordan offers him a chance to make amends. Jordan invites Davis to participate in a series of community discussions on police reform, giving the officer an opportunity to learn from his mistakes and advocate for change. Davis, humbled and remorseful, accepts the offer, realizing that this is his chance at redemption. The story ends not with vengeance, but with hope. Jordan's grace and intelligence turn a moment of personal injustice into a powerful movement for change, proving that even in the face of prejudice and hatred, it's possible to rise above and make a real difference. Earlier that day, Jordan Matthews walked into the bank, dressed simply in a plain shirt and jeans. He didn't appear like someone who was incredibly wealthy, and to anyone watching, he looked like an average man going about his day. Jordan was calm and confident, but not in an arrogant way. He didn't need to show off who he was because he knew what he had achieved. He had built his success from the ground up, and now, as one of the wealthiest people in the country, he felt no need to flaunt his riches. The bank employees, however, didn't know who he was, and that's where the story began to unfold. As Jordan approached the counter, he greeted the teller with a polite smile. He requested to make a large withdrawal, enough money that would make most people nervous to handle. The teller paused for a moment, surprised at the amount, but proceeded with the transaction. Jordan handed over his identification and waited patiently. While he stood there, some of the employees in the bank exchanged glances, whispering quietly to each other. They weren't sure who he was, but his calm demeanor and the size of the transaction piqued their curiosity. Outside, parked just near the entrance, was a sleek, luxury car, another subtle hint of his wealth, though he didn't make any effort to draw attention to it. At the same time, Officer Brian Davis stood near the back of the bank, casually observing the customers. He was on duty as part of his routine security role, but his mind wasn't fully focused on the task at hand. Davis was a cop who felt stuck in his career. He had been on the force for years, but had never moved up the ranks the way he thought he deserved. In his mind, he had been overlooked for promotions too many times, and his bitterness grew with each passing year. This dissatisfaction in his career had turned him into someone who was quick to judge, often seeing the worst in people without taking the time to understand their situation. As Jordan continued to wait for his transaction to process, Officer Davis noticed him from across the room. His attention was drawn to Jordan not because of anything specific, but because of how he looked. Davis saw a black man in simple clothes asking for a large sum of money, and immediately his mind jumped to negative conclusions. He didn't know Jordan, didn't know his story, but that didn't stop Davis from forming a judgment in his head. This was typical for him. He often assumed the worst about people based on their appearance. In his eyes, someone like Jordan didn't belong in a place like this, asking for that much money. Davis began to walk toward the counter where Jordan was standing, his face showing the skepticism he felt. As he approached, the camera caught subtle details. Davis's narrowed eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw. These were small signs of his internal bias, the prejudice he carried with him on a daily basis. He had a chip on his shoulder, feeling that the world owed him something more, and his frustration had turned into a dangerous habit of making snap judgments about people. Jordan, on the other hand, was completely unaware of Davis's growing suspicion. He remained calm, his mind focused on the transaction, knowing he had every right to be there. His life had taught him how to stay composed under pressure, and even in moments like this, he trusted that the truth would prevail. But as the minutes ticked by and the teller continued to process the large withdrawal, Davis's suspicion grew. He didn't see Jordan as a successful businessman. Instead, he saw him as someone who was up to no good. The bank teller, while doing her job, noticed the presence of Officer Davis hovering nearby. She could sense the tension building, though she didn't understand why. She had been in the process of confirming Jordan's identity, making sure everything was in order for such a large transaction. The whispering among the employees continued, and though no one directly said anything to Officer Davis, their unease seemed to confirm his suspicions. To him, the fact that Jordan didn't look like a typical wealthy customer only added to the idea that something wasn't right. Jordan remained patient, his posture relaxed. He wasn't in a hurry, nor did he feel the need to explain himself. He knew that his identification would clear him, and soon enough, he'd be on his way. But to Davis, this calmness was another red flag. The officer had seen too many situations where someone acted calm to hide their true intentions. He decided that Jordan's behavior, combined with his appearance and the large sum of money, was enough to warrant further questioning. Davis stepped closer to the counter, his presence now fully imposing. He leaned slightly toward the teller and asked her if everything was all right. The teller, caught off guard, hesitated before responding. She told Davis that the transaction was large but legitimate, as she was still in the process of verifying the details. But Davis wasn't satisfied. He didn't trust Jordan, and in his mind, something was off. His judgment was clouded by his own biases, and he wasn't willing to consider that Jordan could simply be a successful man going about his business. The tension in the room started to rise as Davis's suspicions became more evident. Jordan noticed the officer's growing interest in him, but he remained silent. He had been in situations like this before, where people made assumptions about him based on his appearance. He knew better than to react hastily. Instead, he waited, letting the situation unfold, knowing that the truth would come out in time. His calmness only seemed to irritate Davis more. The officer couldn't shake the feeling that Jordan was hiding something. As the moments passed, Davis finally spoke directly to Jordan, his voice carrying an edge of authority. He asked Jordan why he needed such a large sum of money, his tone implying that Jordan had no right to make such a request. Jordan, still calm, responded simply, explaining that it was his money and he needed it for business purposes. But Davis wasn't satisfied with the answer. In his mind, Jordan's explanation wasn't enough to clear the suspicion he felt. The audience, watching this unfold, could feel the injustice of the moment. They could see that Davis was jumping to conclusions based on nothing more than Jordan's appearance and the size of his withdrawal. The power dynamic between the two men was clear. Davis, with his authority as a police officer, believed he had the right to question Jordan's every move, while Jordan, despite his wealth and success, was being treated like a suspect. As the scene continued to build, the tension between Jordan and Officer Davis became almost unbearable. The audience knew that something was about to happen, but the question was, how would it unfold? Jordan's calmness hinted at a deeper strength, while Davis's growing aggression showed that he was on the verge of making a serious mistake. This moment, filled with tension and unspoken conflict, set the stage for everything that was to come. Jordan, the underdog in this situation, was about to face an act of injustice that would change the course of the day, while Davis, blended by his own biases, was on the brink of a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. The audience could feel the weight of what was happening, and they were drawn deeper into the story, waiting to see how this clash between these two men would play out. Jordan walked up to the bank teller and politely asked to withdraw a large sum of money. His request was simple, but the amount he wanted was not something the teller saw every day. As she looked at the figure, her expression changed slightly. She wasn't used to handling such large transactions without a little extra verification. She smiled nervously at Jordan, trying to stay professional, but her slight hesitation was noticeable. Jordan, having been in situations like this before, remained calm. He knew this was just part of the process, and eventually the teller would approve the withdrawal. However, the delay caught the attention of Officer Davis, who was stationed nearby. Davis had already noticed Jordan when he entered the bank, but now his suspicion grew. From his vantage point, he could see that something was taking longer than usual at the counter, and in his mind, that was a red flag. Jordan's casual appearance, combined with the large transaction, triggered Davis's instincts, and not in a good way. He didn't see a successful businessman standing at the counter. Instead, he saw a man who, in his view, didn't belong in this bank or dealing with that kind of money. As the teller continued to process the transaction, Officer Davis watched more closely, his suspicion turning into certainty. He didn't need any proof. In his mind, something was wrong. The teller's hesitation and nervous demeanor only confirmed what Davis was already thinking. To him, this was clearly a case of fraud, or worse. He couldn't imagine a reason why Jordan, dressed so simply, would be making such a large withdrawal unless he was up to something shady. Jordan, standing at the counter, was still waiting patiently. He noticed the teller's slight discomfort, but didn't think much of it. After all, he had provided all the necessary documentation, and everything was in order. This wasn't the first time he had made a large transaction, and he trusted the process. But what he didn't know was that Officer Davis was now fully focused on him, and the situation was about to escalate. As more time passed, Officer Davis decided he couldn't wait any longer. Without any concrete evidence, without asking the teller for clarification, and without speaking to Jordan, he approached the counter. His steps were heavy with authority, and his face showed the judgment he had already passed. To Davis, this wasn't a case of innocent until proven guilty. He had made up his mind. Jordan was committing a crime, and it was his duty to stop it. Davis stood beside Jordan, towering over him slightly, his presence intimidating. He didn't ask what was going on. Instead, he went straight to accusations. In a firm, almost aggressive tone, he asked Jordan what he was doing and why he needed so much money. His voice carried an air of suspicion, as though Jordan's very presence in the bank was suspicious. Jordan turned to face Officer Davis, his expression still calm, though he could feel the tension rising. He explained simply that he was making a withdrawal from his account, something that should have been routine. He kept his voice steady, not wanting to escalate the situation, but Davis wasn't listening. The officer's suspicion had already clouded his judgment, and no amount of explanation from Jordan was going to change his mind. The teller, still processing the transaction, tried to intervene. She explained to Officer Davis that everything was legitimate, and she was just waiting for final approval. But Davis waved her off. To him, the delay in the transaction was proof that something was wrong, and he wasn't about to let it slide. He ignored the teller's reassurance and focused all his attention on Jordan, who was now caught in the middle of an accusation he didn't deserve. Jordan, realizing that Davis wasn't going to listen to reason, remained calm but firm. He knew his rights, and he wasn't about to let this situation spiral out of control without defending himself. He explained again, this time more clearly, that he was simply withdrawing his own money. But Davis didn't care about Jordan's explanation. In the officer's mind, Jordan's calmness wasn't a sign of innocence. It was a sign of guilt. Davis believed Jordan was trying to talk his way out of trouble, and that only fueled the officer's aggressive approach. The power dynamic was clear to everyone watching. Officer Davis, with his uniform and badge, held all the authority in this situation. Jordan, despite his wealth and status outside of this bank, was powerless in this moment. To the bystanders, it was clear that Davis was using his position to push Jordan into a corner, and there was little Jordan could do to stop it. He was being treated like a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. As the confrontation continued, Officer Davis grew more aggressive. He accused Jordan of attempting fraud, his tone now sharper, almost angry. Jordan, still calm, denied the accusations, repeating that he was only trying to access his own funds. But Davis wasn't hearing it. The officer's mind was made up, and nothing Jordan said could change that. Davis was convinced that he had caught a criminal in the act, and he was determined to make an arrest. Without warning, Davis pulled out his handcuffs. The teller gasped, and a few of the bank employees exchanged worried glances. Jordan, though surprised by how quickly things were escalating, didn't resist. He knew better than to argue with someone in Davis' position. But that didn't make the situation any less humiliating. As Davis snapped the cuffs around Jordan's wrists, the entire bank watched in stunned silence. Jordan stood there, handcuffed in front of everyone, while Officer Davis led him toward the exit. The bank employees, still in shock, didn't know what to do. Some of them knew that Jordan was a regular customer, but no one had the courage to step forward and challenge Davis. The power dynamic was too strong, and Davis, in his authority as a police officer, had taken complete control of the situation. As Jordan was led out of the bank, people outside began to notice the commotion. A small crowd gathered, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Jordan, walking calmly despite the handcuffs, kept his head held high. He knew this wasn't right, but he also knew there would be a time and place to fight back. For now, he had to endure the public humiliation, knowing that the truth would come out eventually. The moment was filled with tension. Officer Davis, in his misguided sense of duty, believed he had stopped a crime. Jordan, though outwardly calm, was struggling with the injustice of it all. How could someone like him, who had worked so hard to build his success, be treated this way simply because of how he looked? The power imbalance between the two men was stark, and it was clear to everyone watching that this was more than just a misunderstanding. This was a case of bias, of judgment based on appearances, and Jordan was the one paying the price. As they reached the patrol car, Davis pushed Jordan into the back seat, still treating him like a dangerous criminal. The crowd outside continued to watch, some murmuring in disbelief. Others, realizing that something wasn't right, began to share the videos they had taken on social media. Within minutes, the incident would become public knowledge, sparking outrage and questions about what had really happened in that bank. But for now, Jordan sat in the back of the police car, his mind racing. He knew that this moment would have consequences, not just for him, but for Officer Davis as well. The officer, blinded by his own prejudice, had made a serious mistake. And while Jordan couldn't do anything about it in this moment, he knew that the truth would come out, and when it did, the balance of power would shift. As Officer Davis drove Jordan to the police station, he still believed he had done the right thing. In his mind, everything added up. Someone like Jordan, casually dressed, asking for a large amount of money at the bank, had to be up to something shady. Davis felt a sense of satisfaction, thinking he had stopped a criminal from getting away with fraud. Jordan, sitting calmly in the back seat, said nothing. He knew there was no point in arguing or trying to explain himself any further. His mind was focused on what would happen next, and he was prepared for it. When they arrived at the station, Davis led Jordan inside, still treating him as if he were guilty. The officers at the front desk barely glanced at Jordan as he was brought in, their attention more focused on routine paperwork than what was actually happening. Davis began filling out the necessary forms for processing Jordan, preparing to book him officially. Jordan, still in handcuffs, stood quietly nearby, waiting for his chance to prove who he was. But outside the station, something much bigger was already unfolding. The video of Jordan's arrest, captured by the bystanders at the bank, had spread quickly on social media. Within minutes, it went viral, with people sharing the video across multiple platforms, calling out the obvious racial profiling and injustice. The hashtags started trending, and soon enough, local news reporters caught wind of the story. Activists who had been fighting against police misconduct for years were alerted, and they immediately took action. As Officer Davis continued with the booking process, the front door of the station opened, and a flood of people began to pour in. Reporters, with their cameras rolling, demanded to know why a man like Jordan had been arrested. Lawyers arrived, asking for immediate access to the man who had been unjustly detained. Activists held signs outside the station, calling for justice and transparency. The peaceful police station was now a scene of chaos, as the officers struggled to manage the growing crowd. Inside, Officer Davis noticed the commotion but paid little attention to it. He was too focused on finishing the paperwork. Finally, it was time for him to check Jordan's identification properly. He hadn't bothered to look closely before, assuming it didn't matter since he had already made up his mind about Jordan. But now, as he typed Jordan's information into the system, the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. The screen in front of Davis showed Jordan's full name: Jordan Matthews, billionaire philanthropist, owner of multiple successful businesses, and a well-known figure in both the corporate world and charitable organizations. Davis's jaw dropped as he stared at the information on the screen. This was not some ordinary man standing in front of him. This was a man of immense wealth and influence, someone who had connections in every corner of the city. For a moment, Officer Davis couldn't believe what he was seeing. He had assumed Jordan was a criminal based solely on his appearance and the amount of money he had tried to withdraw. But now, the truth was staring him in the face, and it was clear that he had made a terrible mistake. The officer's heart began to race as he realized the gravity of the situation. He hadn't just arrested anyone. He had arrested a man who could potentially ruin his career with a single phone call. But the twist didn't end there. As Davis continued to read through Jordan's profile, he came across a detail that made his stomach drop even further. Just a few weeks prior, Jordan had made a significant donation to the city's police reform initiative. The very initiative that Davis had heard about, but had paid little attention to. Jordan's donation had gone toward funding programs that aimed to retrain officers like Davis, teaching them how to handle situations without bias or prejudice. In other words, Jordan had been working to fix the exact problem that had led to his wrongful arrest. Davis's mind raced as the full realization of his mistake sunk in. Not only had he arrested a billionaire, but he had also arrested someone who had been trying to help improve the police force, someone who believed in reform and had taken concrete steps to make it happen. The irony of the situation was overwhelming, and Davis felt a wave of panic wash over him. He had treated Jordan like a criminal, but in reality, Jordan had been one of the people trying to prevent officers from making the very mistake Davis had just made. Meanwhile, outside the station, the crowd of reporters, activists, and lawyers continued to grow. News outlets had picked up the story, and the public was demanding answers. Everyone wanted to know why Jordan Matthews, a man known for his generosity and contributions to the community, had been treated like a common criminal. The station was quickly becoming a media circus, and the officers inside were struggling to contain the situation. Back inside, Davis was frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. He had two choices. He could either try to continue with the booking process and pretend that nothing was wrong, or he could admit to his mistake and release Jordan immediately. But before he could make a decision, the station's captain entered the room, his face filled with frustration and concern. He had just been informed about who Jordan really was, and he wasn't happy. "What the hell is going on here?" the captain demanded, glaring at Officer Davis. "Do you know who this man is?" Davis tried to stammer out an explanation, but the captain cut him off. "I don't care what you thought," the captain said angrily. "You've made a huge mistake. This man has done more for this city than you'll ever understand, and you just arrested him without cause." Jordan, still standing calmly, watched the scene unfold. He knew he could have easily made a scene or demanded immediate retribution, but that wasn't his style. Instead, he remained silent, waiting for the officers to correct their mistake. The captain quickly ordered Jordan's release, and within moments, the handcuffs were removed. Davis stood there, speechless, as the captain apologized profusely to Jordan, explaining that this should never have happened. Jordan nodded but didn't say much. He knew that words wouldn't fix the situation, but actions could. As Jordan walked out of the station, the reporters rushed toward him, eager to hear his side of the story. But Jordan didn't speak to them either. He knew that the real message would come later, once he had time to reflect on the situation and decide how best to address it. He had always believed in using his influence for good, and now more than ever, he saw an opportunity to make real change. As he stepped into his luxury car and drove away, the station was left in chaos. Officer Davis, still reeling from the discovery of Jordan's identity, knew that his career was on the line. He had made a mistake that would follow him for a long time, and there was no undoing what had happened. But for Jordan, this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where he could use this experience to push even harder for the reforms he believed in. The twist in the story wasn't just that Jordan was a billionaire, or that he had donated to the police reform initiative. The real twist was how he chose to handle the situation. Jordan could have easily destroyed Davis's career, but instead, he saw an opportunity to turn this incident into something positive. He knew that real change didn't come from revenge or anger. It came from education, understanding, and working together to fix the system. And so, as the media storm continued to swirl, Jordan began planning his next steps. He would speak out about what had happened, not to shame the officers involved, but to highlight the importance of the very reforms he had been supporting all along. He would use this moment to show the world that even in the face of injustice, there was always a chance to create something better. After the chaos of his wrongful arrest, everyone expected Jordan to react with anger, perhaps even file a lawsuit or publicly humiliate Officer Davis. It would have been understandable, given how unfairly he had been treated. The media was buzzing with talk about how Jordan, a billionaire, had been racially profiled, and many were waiting to see how he would respond. Some predicted that he would sue the police department, demand an apology, or even press for Officer Davis to be fired. But Jordan had a different approach in mind, one that surprised everyone. Rather than seek revenge or even monetary compensation for the injustice he faced, Jordan chose to take a higher road. Instead of retaliating, he reached out to the police department and suggested something completely unexpected: a public conversation. He proposed to meet with Officer Davis and have an open discussion about what had happened, but not just between the two of them. He wanted it to be public, with cameras rolling, so that people all across the country could witness the conversation. Jordan wanted to talk about the deeper issues that had led to his arrest: racial bias, prejudice, and the systemic problems in the justice system. When the news broke that Jordan wasn't going to sue, but instead wanted to sit down with the officer who had arrested him, the public was stunned. People couldn't believe it. Why would a man who had every right to be furious choose to forgive and open a dialogue? It was almost unheard of. But that's exactly what made Jordan different. He didn't see this as just a personal issue. He knew that his experience was part of a much bigger problem, one that affected millions of people every day, and he wanted to use his platform to address that. The day of the public conversation came, and it was broadcasted live on multiple channels. Reporters, activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens tuned in, curious to see how it would unfold. The room was packed with people, and there was a sense of tension in the air as Officer Davis entered the room, visibly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not in such a controversial way. He had made a mistake, and now the whole world was watching as he sat across from the man he had wronged. Jordan, as always, was calm and composed. He greeted Officer Davis with a handshake, showing no signs of anger or resentment. The camera zoomed in on the two men as they sat down, facing each other. What followed wasn't an argument or a heated exchange, but a conversation, a real, honest conversation about race, power, and the justice system. Jordan didn't attack Davis for what he had done. Instead, he asked him questions, trying to understand why the officer had made the assumptions he did. Davis, who had been defensive at first, slowly began to open up. He admitted that he had been wrong, that he had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment. He spoke about the pressures he felt as a police officer, the constant fear of making the wrong call, but also acknowledged that none of that excused what he had done. He expressed regret, not just for arresting Jordan, but for the deeper prejudice that had influenced his actions. Jordan listened patiently, nodding as Davis spoke, and when it was his turn to respond, he didn't lash out. Instead, he shared his own experiences as a black man in America, even as someone who had achieved great success. He talked about the many times he had been judged based on his appearance, how it wasn't just this one incident, but a lifetime of subtle and not-so-subtle prejudices. He explained that this wasn't just about one bad cop or one bad decision. It was about a system that allowed these kinds of judgments to happen over and over again. As the conversation continued, it became clear that this wasn't just about Jordan and Davis. It was about a much larger issue, one that resonated with people all across the country. Jordan wasn't there to shame Officer Davis or make him the villain. Instead, he was trying to open people's eyes to the systemic problems that led to these kinds of situations. His message was clear. The problem wasn't just with individual officers, but with the entire system that allowed racial bias to influence decisions. The conversation quickly went viral, with clips from the meeting being shared all over social media. People were inspired by Jordan's approach, how he chose to educate rather than retaliate. He had taken an incident that could have been filled with anger and resentment and turned it into a moment of learning and growth, not just for Officer Davis, but for everyone watching. It sparked a national debate about the role of race in policing, about the power dynamics between law enforcement and citizens, and about how these issues could be addressed. Jordan's decision to hold the public conversation became a turning point in how people viewed racial injustice. Instead of simply focusing on punishment or revenge, the conversation opened up a dialogue about solutions. Jordan made it clear that while individual accountability was important, the real challenge was fixing the systems that allowed racial bias to persist. He called for more training, more accountability, and more conversations like the one he was having with Officer Davis. He believed that real change would only come when people were willing to talk openly about the problem, admit their mistakes, and work together to find solutions. What made the moment even more powerful was the fact that Jordan didn't have to do any of this. As a billionaire, he could have easily sued the police department, walked away with a large settlement, and moved on with his life. But that wasn't what Jordan was about. He saw his wealth and influence as tools to make a difference. And this conversation was just one example of how he used those tools to empower others. In the days and weeks that followed, the public conversation continued to spark dialogue across the country. Police departments in other cities began to take notice, some even reaching out to Jordan to ask for his advice on how to implement reforms. Activists praised his approach, saying that it provided a roadmap for how to address these difficult issues without resorting to anger or violence. Jordan's message was clear. Real empowerment came from education, from understanding, and from working together to make the system better for everyone. As for Officer Davis, the conversation marked a turning point in his own life as well. He had gone into the meeting expecting to be humiliated, but instead, he walked away with a new perspective. He realized that he had been part of the problem, but he also saw that there was a way to be part of the solution. He joined efforts to improve police training, specifically focusing on racial bias and how to prevent situations like the one with Jordan from happening again. Jordan's decision to hold a public conversation instead of retaliating became a powerful example of how change could happen. His approach didn't just solve the immediate problem. It sparked a movement for deeper, systemic change. By choosing education over anger, Jordan showed the world that empowerment wasn't about getting even. It was about lifting others up, even those who had wronged you, and working together to create a better future. In the end, Jordan's message of empowerment resonated far beyond the walls of that police station. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there was always a path forward that could lead to healing, understanding, and progress. Jordan's choice to engage in a conversation rather than seek revenge showed that real power came not from fighting back, but from lifting others up, from using one's influence to create lasting, positive change. The public conversation between Jordan and Officer Davis was building to a critical point. The room was filled with tension, cameras capturing every moment, and people watching across the country, waiting to see how it would unfold. Officer Davis sat across from Jordan, visibly uncomfortable but determined to defend himself. He started by explaining his actions, talking about the pressures of being a police officer, the split-second decisions he had to make, and the stress of trying to keep people safe. His voice was shaky, his words uncertain, as he tried to justify why he had arrested Jordan at the bank that day. Davis spoke about how, in the moment, he thought he was doing the right thing. He claimed that the situation looked suspicious to him and that he had acted on his instincts. But as he talked, it became clear that even he wasn't fully convinced by his own explanation. The audience could sense it too. Davis was trying to find a reason for his actions, but deep down, he knew the truth was much simpler and much harder to admit. His arrest of Jordan wasn't about the facts of the situation. It was about the assumptions he had made, based on nothing more than Jordan's appearance. Jordan sat quietly, listening to Davis speak. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Davis's growing unease. Jordan didn't interrupt or challenge the officer's words. He allowed him to talk, knowing that the truth would eventually surface. And sure enough, as Davis continued, his defenses began to crumble. His voice, which had started out steady, became more strained. His excuses started to fall apart as he realized that no amount of explanation could change what he had done. Finally, Davis stopped trying to defend himself. He paused, took a deep breath, and looked at Jordan with a sense of defeat. The weight of his actions had caught up with him, and he could no longer hide behind his role as a police officer. In that moment, something shifted. Davis stopped being an officer trying to justify his actions and became a man grappling with the prejudice that had shaped his decisions. The audience could feel the emotional shift, too. The room, which had been filled with tension, now felt heavy with the raw vulnerability of the moment. Davis lowered his head, his voice barely above a whisper as he admitted the truth. He acknowledged that he had acted out of prejudice, that he had made assumptions about Jordan simply because of how he looked. The words came slowly, each one filled with regret. "I was wrong," Davis said, his voice cracking. "I let my biases take over. I didn't see you for who you are. I saw what I wanted to see, and I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." The confession hit the room like a wave. Davis's admission of his prejudice was something no one had expected, least of all himself. For the first time, he was confronting the deep-seated biases that had been a part of him for so long. And in doing so, he was exposing the vulnerability that came with that realization. Tears welled up in his eyes as he continued to apologize, this time not just to Jordan, but to everyone watching. He knew that his actions had been wrong, not just in this one instance, but in the way he had approached his job for years. The emotional conflict between Jordan and Davis had reached its peak. For the first time, Davis was truly remorseful, and the audience could feel the weight of that remorse. Davis wasn't just asking for forgiveness, he was begging for it. The vulnerability in his voice, the rawness of his emotions, created a powerful moment of realization. Davis wasn't just an officer who had made a mistake. He was a man confronting the prejudice that had shaped his life. Jordan, throughout this emotional breakdown, remained calm and composed, but it was clear that he was deeply moved by Davis's confession. He could see that Davis was genuinely remorseful, and he respected the fact that the officer had been brave enough to admit his mistakes in front of the world. But Jordan also knew that forgiveness alone wasn't enough. While he could forgive Davis for what he had done, it wouldn't change the fact that the system that allowed this kind of prejudice to flourish needed to be reformed. When it was Jordan's turn to speak, the room went silent. Everyone was waiting to hear how he would respond. Would he accept Davis's apology? Would he forgive him? Or would he call for harsher consequences? Jordan took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady and filled with the quiet strength that had carried him through the entire ordeal. "I forgive you," Jordan said, his eyes meeting Davis's. The words were simple, but they carried immense weight. Davis looked up, his eyes filled with relief and gratitude. But Jordan wasn't finished. "Forgiveness is important," he continued, "but it doesn't change what happened. And it doesn't fix the system that allowed it to happen in the first place." Jordan's words cut through the room, bringing the conversation to a deeper level. He wasn't just talking about what had happened between him and Davis. He was talking about the larger issue at hand, the systemic injustice that allowed racial bias to influence decisions. "This isn't just about you and me," Jordan said. "This is about a system that needs to change. Forgiveness is one step, but it's not the solution. The solution is fixing the system so that this doesn't happen again to anyone." The audience was captivated. Jordan had taken what could have been a moment of personal victory and turned it into a call for change. His message wasn't just about forgiving one man. It was about addressing the root of the problem, systemic injustice. He spoke about the need for better training for police officers, the importance of acknowledging racial bias, and the necessity of holding people accountable when they allowed those biases to influence their actions. Davis, still visibly emotional, nodded in agreement. He knew that Jordan was right. His apology and Jordan's forgiveness were important, but they didn't erase the need for change. Davis looked at Jordan with a newfound respect. understanding that this wasn't just about his personal redemption. It was about something much bigger. The climax of the conversation was a powerful moment of vulnerability, realization, and reconciliation. Davis had broken down, admitting his mistakes and asking for forgiveness, while Jordan had responded with grace and wisdom. But Jordan's message went beyond forgiveness. It was a message of empowerment and systemic change. He had used the opportunity to not only forgive, but to elevate the conversation, turning it into a call for action. The audience watching the conversation unfold couldn't help but be moved by the emotional intensity of the moment. The conflict between Jordan and Davis had been resolved, not through anger or revenge, but through understanding and a shared desire for change. It was a moment of growth for both men. Davis had confronted his prejudice, and Jordan had shown the world the power of forgiveness combined with a demand for justice. As the conversation came to an end, the room was filled with a sense of hope. Jordan had not only forgiven Davis, but had also sparked a larger conversation about how to fix the system. The emotional conflict between the two men had been resolved, but the journey towards systemic change was just beginning. Jordan's powerful response had made it clear that while forgiveness was important, real change required action, and he was ready to lead the way. The audience, both in the room and across the country, was left with a lasting message. That true empowerment came not from holding onto anger, but from using difficult moments to push for justice and equality. Jordan had shown the world that even in the face of injustice, there was a way forward, one that combined forgiveness with a demand for change. And in doing so, he had created a powerful moment of emotional resolution and hope for the future. The emotional public conversation between Jordan and Officer Davis, the story didn't end there. The video of their dialogue had gone viral, not just because of the raw emotions on display, but because of the way Jordan handled the entire situation. People were amazed at how he had chosen to forgive Davis, yet still called for systemic change. It wasn't just about one man's mistake anymore. It was about something much bigger, and Jordan knew he had to use this moment to spark real action. The media coverage of the conversation continued to grow, and social media platforms were filled with discussions about race, power, and police reform. Jordan had become a symbol of empowerment, not just for Black Americans, but for all marginalized groups who had faced injustice. His calm, powerful response to what had happened became an inspiration for people across the country. It was clear that Jordan had the attention of the entire nation, and he wasn't going to let this moment slip away. Instead of letting the viral attention die down, Jordan decided to take the next step. He announced that he would be launching a major initiative aimed at reforming the police system. His plan wasn't just about holding individual officers accountable, but about changing the way law enforcement operated on a broader level. Jordan's initiative focused on training officers to recognize and overcome their biases, promoting community policing, and implementing policies that would prevent racial profiling and ensure fair treatment for all citizens. The initiative was bold, and it quickly gained support from activists, community leaders, and even some politicians. Jordan used his resources and influence to bring together a coalition of people who were committed to making real change happen. He wasn't just talking about reform, he was actively creating it. The message was clear. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about education, accountability, and building a better future for everyone. But the twist in the story came when it was revealed that Officer Davis had been suspended from the police force following the incident. While many people were calling for Davis to be fired permanently, Jordan had a different idea. He reached out to Davis and offered him a chance to be part of the very initiative that was being launched. Jordan believed that Davis's experience and regret could be used as a tool to help other officers learn from their mistakes. It was a surprising move. Most people expected Jordan to distance himself from Davis, especially after everything that had happened. But instead, Jordan saw an opportunity to turn Davis's mistake into something positive. He offered Davis a role in the reform initiative, where he would speak to other officers about the dangers of letting prejudice influence their decisions. Davis, still grappling with his guilt and regret, accepted the offer. He knew he had a lot to make up for, and he was eager to do whatever he could to be part of the solution. This decision shocked many people, but it also reinforced Jordan's message of empowerment and forgiveness. By including Davis in the reform process, Jordan showed that real change wasn't about pushing people away. It was about bringing them in and helping them grow. Davis's inclusion in the initiative added another layer to the story, turning it into one of redemption and transformation. Davis wasn't just a villain in this story. He became a symbol of how people can change and learn from their mistakes. As the initiative gained momentum, Jordan began traveling around the country, speaking to communities, police departments, and lawmakers about the need for reform. His message was one of hope and empowerment. He encouraged people to stand up for their rights, to demand fair treatment, and to work together to create a justice system that served everyone equally. He reminded people that while the system was flawed, it could be changed if enough people came together to demand it. Jordan's story resonated deeply with people from all walks of life. Marginalized individuals, who had often felt powerless in the face of injustice, found strength in Jordan's example. He had shown them that even when the system seemed stacked against them, they could still fight for change and win. His initiative wasn't just about police reform. It was about empowering people to believe that their voices mattered, that they could make a difference no matter how daunting the challenge seemed. Throughout all of this, Officer Davis became an integral part of the movement. He gave speeches at police training programs, sharing his story and urging other officers to take a hard look at their own biases. He admitted his mistakes openly, and his vulnerability helped break down the defensive walls that many officers had built around themselves. By hearing Davis's story, many police officers began to reflect on their own behavior, realizing that change had to start with them. The story of Jordan and Davis spread far beyond the United States. It became a global symbol of how forgiveness, education, and accountability could lead to real change. People around the world began to see that systemic injustice wasn't something that could be fixed by anger or blame alone. It required empathy, understanding, and a willingness to work together. Jordan's message of empowerment had crossed borders, inspiring movements for justice and equality in other countries as well. The story ended on a hopeful note, but it was clear that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. Jordan's initiative had gained national attention, and real changes were starting to happen in police departments across the country. Laws were being proposed that would hold officers accountable for racial profiling, and new training programs were being developed to help officers recognize and confront their biases. Jordan's vision for a more just and equitable society was slowly becoming a reality. For Officer Davis, the journey was one of redemption. He had gone from being the villain of the story to becoming a voice for change. His involvement in the initiative showed that people could learn from their mistakes, that even those who had done wrong could become part of the solution. Davis had been given a second chance, and he used it to make amends for what he had done. In the end, Jordan's story wasn't just about one man's wrongful arrest. It was about the power of forgiveness, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the belief that change is possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. His decision to turn a moment of personal injustice into a movement for systemic reform inspired millions of people, giving them hope that they too could make a difference. As the final chapter of the story unfolded, Jordan's message of empowerment and change echoed across the country, leaving a lasting impact on everyone who heard it. The emotional connection that people felt with his journey was undeniable. He had shown that even in the darkest moments, there was always a path forward, and that true strength came not from anger or revenge, but from the courage to forgive, to educate, and to fight for a better future for all. And so Jordan's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that change was not only possible but inevitable when people came